Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast about the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. I'm Liam McGrath, and joining me once again in the studio is our guru of urban history, Daniel Gooch. In this episode, we'll be continuing our tour of Oxford. And last time, you can find it on all your podcast directories. You'll find our introduction to Oxford, where we talked an overview of the history of Oxford and in particular about the history of the university. Today, we'll be focused on our politics and war category. Now, Daniel, what kind of things will we be covering in politics and war?
We look at battles, we look at major political figures that might have come from or whose lives or careers might have been shaped by the places we're looking at. Really anything that's had a significant, lasting, world-shaping or nation-shaping legacy in those fields. And I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say that there's going to be a lot to talk about when it comes to Oxford.
Yes, Oxford has a lot of history when it comes to politics and war, so it's going to take up an entire episode. So let's get on with it, Daniel. Let's start with the politics, and we're going to go right back in time. London has obviously been the capital of Britain since, at least the Norman conquest. But for various periods of medieval England, if you wanted power, it's fair to say you'd find it in Oxford.
Well, yes. I mean, first thing I'll talk about here, I think, really is Parliament. You talk about the seat of power. Oxford, many parliaments, 11 proper parliaments have been held in Oxford, mainly under Henry III and the Stuarts, plus broadly equivalent councils under the Saxons have been held in Oxford. I should say that although Oxford is definitely not the only provincial city that has held parliaments, it is notable because outside London, only York, the kind of unofficial capital of the north for much of the Middle Ages, has held more. Oxford is number 3 only to those two, which shows you just how important it has been. You had Saxon Wittens held there. Ethelred the Unready held a council there in 1025. To Canute in 1018. King John later held a council in Oxford. But perhaps the most significant Oxford Parliament came in 1258 during the reign of John's son, Henry III. Henry and his father were involved in tussles for power with major nobles, the barons, hence their names, the Barons' Wars. And this Oxford Parliament brought about the famous Provisions of Oxford. Now these, you might have heard of them, these were basically major constitutional reforms which were aimed at curtailing the power of the king by giving the barons more influence. Unfortunately, they weren't immediately successful. Henry broke the agreements and the Second Barons' War followed. But they probably had some lasting legacy in showing how the limits of a king's powers could be set. Other significant parliaments in Oxford include the ones that met in 1644 and 1645 during the Civil War, which we will talk a bit more about later, I think, when we talk about the military history of Oxford. And finally, the 1681 Parliament under Charles II, which was the very last time that Parliament ever met outside Westminster back in 1681. It's all been in London since then.
Wow, that's quite a claim. Now, the Provisions of Oxford, that really is a remarkable document, I suppose, because it's just so old. And I must admit, I hadn't heard of it. So you always learn something on Ye Olde Guide. Oh, it's a hugely significant document, one of the oldest documents in English constitutional history, I suppose. So it's really important, and those parliaments have left a lasting mark. And I suppose there'll be sites within Oxford that you could visit that would have hosted Balliol College, for example. Now, a curiosity, I suppose, of Oxford's politics is that the university had its own constituency, sort of parliamentary constituency, until very recently.
Yes, it did. Like several other universities across the UK, Oxford University had its very own university constituency in British general elections and the right to return members of Parliament from 1603 until as late as 1950. Now, from 1603 until 1868, Oxford and Cambridge were the only English university constituencies, though Dublin University was represented in the Irish Parliament from 1613 and the UK Parliament from 1801. By the time the university constituencies were abolished, only Oxford, Cambridge and London had their own new constituencies, while several others were all represented by a single combined English universities constituency. Plus, there were MPs for Welsh and Scottish universities. So, yeah, this anachronism lasted about 350 years. Now, into maybe the lifetimes of some of our listeners.
Now, I suppose another major centre of power in this era was the church, and there's really a lot still to see in Oxford that sort of represents some of the history around what's gone on in Oxford over the years. Could you tell us about the Reformation and the importance of Oxford to the Reformation?
I think really Oxford's importance here is directly in the Reformation, but also in kind of reformist views even before that against the Catholic seat of power in the UK. I think I'd probably go back to John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a 14th century Oxford scholar, and really this is where Oxford's influence on the English Reformation and reform of the church goes back to. John Wycliffe lived in Oxford, he was an Oxford scholar, and his ideas, such as denial of transubstantiation, that the body and blood of Christ is actually what the bread and wine that you consume during communion actually becomes, and his belief in the supremacy of Scripture, of the Bible, were foundational to the movement known as Lollardy, which was an early kind of sort of proto-Protestant Christian doctrine and really foundational to Protestantism itself. And Wycliffe Hall, a theological college in Oxford, is named after him.
The significance of Oxford goes well beyond that, very much on the tourist trail. If you go to the middle of Oxford, Broad Street, right in the middle, surrounded by the hustle and bustle, the tourists and students cycling around, coffee shops and shops. There's a cross in the road with some bricks. This is on Broad Street. And this spot represents the location of an extraordinary moment in English history, and this is the location where the Oxford martyrs came to their end. You tell us about the background and to that and the significance of this.
Yes, certainly. We'll start with the legend of the underground church. Now, in the centre of Oxford, there's a lovely spire tip coming out of the ground, surrounded by steps which make a very good bench. A joke sometimes told to visitors is that it's the spire of an underground church, and it certainly has that look about it, but it's actually the Martyrs' Memorial, which was put up as a memorial to the Oxford martyrs. Now, the burning of the Oxford martyrs was really resonant even in the early years of the English Reformation. Several senior English Protestant figures from Edward VI's reign, two bishops, and most famously the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, were put on trial in Oxford in 1554 and 1555 and burned to death under Edward's sister and successor, Mary I, as also known for probably fairly clear reasons in a new Protestant country as Bloody Mary. And we should probably give an overview of the personalities involved here. First, you have Edward and Mary's father, Henry VIII, who really kick-started the break with the Catholic Church. When he died, he famously had 3 legitimate children, 1 son and 2 daughters. The one son, Edward, was the 3rd oldest child, who, despite being the youngest and only 9 at Henry's death, became King Edward VI when Henry died. Edward, if I can put it bluntly, was an uber Protestant. He'd been raised after the break with Catholicism with a great deal of maternal input from Henry's staunchly Protestant 5th wife, Catherine Parr, and Edward pushed the Reformation even further than his father had. But Edward died after just a few years while still a child, which meant Henry VIII's oldest child, number 1, Mary I, becoming queen next. Now, Mary had been raised very differently and was probably as committed to Catholicism as Edward was to Protestantism, and Mary tried to restore Catholicism to the country. Now, the Oxford martyrs, back to their story, being senior Reformation figures under Edward, were not, it's fair to say, in Mary's good books and were put on trial for heresy. In fact, Thomas Cranmer was already under sentence of death for having supported Lady Jane Grey's failed attempt to accede to the throne, the doomed attempt to sideline Mary and install a Protestant successor to Edward. But almost really to drive the point home, and perhaps also in revenge for helping arrange Henry VIII's divorce from her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary wanted him done for heresy too.
So what happened to these Oxford martyrs?
Well, they all initially refused to recant their beliefs and were sentenced to death, but had to wait around a while for Parliament to change the law to allow death by burning. The 2 bishops were burned in Broad Street, in 1555, which was then a ditch outside the city walls where, as you rightly said, an iron cross marks the location. But Cranmer had to wait a little bit longer for his punishment. Because he was an archbishop, the authorities needed to wait for papal authority to try him separately in 1555. Now, Cranmer saw his colleagues being burned and recanted later, but wasn't saved, and ended up changing his mind again. He famously declared that his hand that had written the recantation should be burnt first. Now, the Martyrs Memorial was put up many centuries later in the 1840s, and it isn't on the execution site, but was put next to a road where travellers could see it. It was made by the great Victorian architect George Gilbert Scott, famous designer of St Pancras Station. So if you see that seeming tip of a church spire, you'll know what it is.
Now he gets about a bit, George Gilbert Scott, doesn't he?
He does,
and that story of Thomas Cranmer, on the pulpit, and he was dragged off to be burnt, starting with the hand. Just an incredible image, isn't it? Just so dramatic, and it happened right there. And I suppose religion has gone on to really define Oxford's political fault lines for centuries on.
It has, yes.
Regularly being a place of theological debate years after, and giving rise to other notable religious influence, fair to say.
Yes, I mean, there have been numerous archbishops and bishops and religious figures who've come from Oxford University. We simply don't have time to list them all. But one thing I will talk about, just to finish on the topic of religion, is Methodism. Methodism is a denomination of Christianity based on John Wesley's teachings. And Wesley studied in Oxford, was ordained there, and set up the Holy Club with his brother in Oxford, which acted within the city community, visiting prisoners in the castle and giving charitable ministry to the ill. As well as establishing their own church, Methodist writings and beliefs were influential in the later abolitionist movement, and they also conducted missionary and educational work inspired by Methodism and inspired by Wesley's teachings.
Wow. So really influential in sort of religious terms. And we've mentioned parliaments, we mentioned religion, but another centre of power is, of course, monarchy and royalty in England. What other royal connections were there with the city?
Well, we mentioned in our introductory episode that 2 Anglo-Saxon kings died in Oxford. One of these was Harold Harefoot, who not only died there, but was also crowned at the council there. There's also Edmund Ironside, son of Ethelred the Unready, who died in 1016. Now, I should concede with Edmund that the sources are split over whether he died in Oxford or in London, though the fact that Oxford's even in the running shows that it was at least a significant enough place in royal circles at the time. As well as deaths and a crowning, Oxford had royal births at its own royal palace, Beaumont Palace, which was the birthplace of Richard I and King John. This was built by Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, and stood near the North Gate before being dismantled after the Reformation, with the last remnants destroyed in 1829. But there is a plaque on its site now in Beaumont Street, and there's part of an arch from the palace in a house's garden in Woodstock Road. Those last little bits are still there.
And later, James II was importantly linked with Oxford, and Oxford had a huge influence on him.
Yes, we should, you're right, single out one monarch's dealings with Oxford, James II, because they did have a part to play in his downfall. Now, a bit of context here. James II was the younger brother of Charles II, son of Charles I, who, of course, lost the Civil War and had his head chopped off. So James became king at a pretty tenuous point, not long after the restoration of the monarchy. He is famous for being a Catholic at a time when the majority of power in the country was not Catholic, for losing the throne to William and Mary during the Glorious Revolution. If you want to hear a little bit more about the one semi-battle that happened during the Glorious Revolution, listen to our Reading episode where we talk about it. Now, one of the main drivers towards this was, of course, James's Catholicism. While his brother Charles II had kind of toyed with Catholicism, he was astute enough not to let it interfere too much with his kingship, while James was unashamedly, openly, and avowedly Catholic, both in his beliefs and in his, more importantly, probably in his politics. One of the critical parts in turning opinion against James, leading to his downfall, was his perceived high-handed treatment of Oxford University in allowing Catholics to hold office at two colleges and in trying to force another college to elect an alleged Catholic as their president. The fellows of the college refused, becoming effectively kind of political martyrs against James, who installed his own fellows there.
So it's just extraordinary how linked all these connections are with the city, and it just goes on and on, doesn't it? Because it has this reputation as being a centre of sort of royal power. It had a lot of visiting foreign royalty as well later on.
That's true. Yeah, Oxford has been used for meetings with foreign diplomats, which shows you how much it felt worth showing off to important people. The most notable of these, I think, was in 1814 during the Napoleonic Wars, when there was a meeting of the leaders of the Allied nations hosted by the Prince Regent at Oxford University. They included the King of Prussia, commander of his forces, Field Marshal Blücher, whose intervention was so decisive at the Battle of Waterloo, and the Emperor of Russia. And the event included visits to buildings you can still see today, the Bodleian Library, banquets in the Radcliffe Camera. And the visit was depicted in two paintings by George Jones, which show the prince being received in the city and the leaders receiving honorary degrees in the Sheldonian Theatre. They're both very easily Googleable if you want to see them.
Now, we're mentioning lots of famous people in this episode, and I think in the last episode, we did preempt this because we said, the just the presence of the university alone has meant that the city has hosted people who have gone on to be, some of the most influential people in history. And I think we said there was something like 2,500 Wikipedia entries for people that had been to Oxford. But I just want to focus on the politicians. Just some highlights of some of the most influential politicians that have studied at the university.
Well, Oxford University has a staggering number of world leaders among its alumni. Couldn't even hope to give really even a summary here, but from a British perspective, that includes 31 prime ministers. Incredibly, all 6 of our most recent prime ministers since David Cameron are Oxford alumni. A lot of them seem to study politics, philosophy and economics, PPE, which was introduced after the Second World War as a new and prestigious course. Other international leaders from Oxford include one Pope, Bill Clinton, political and royal leaders of numerous countries, including Australia and Japan. 15 viceroys of India went to Oxford University, while Edward VII went to Magdalen College, chosen by his father, Prince Albert. Now, of all these prime ministers, I'll just focus on one for a little time. William Gladstone, one of our most famous prime ministers and Victorian statesmen. He's worth looking at because he had links that went beyond just his short time studying in Oxford. He wasn't just a university graduate, he was an Oxford University MP, while serving 4 separate stints as Prime Minister, and was immensely proud of Oxford. He said that being described as an Oxford man was the highest compliment you could receive. And he also gave the first ever Remain lecture, which are famous free public lectures held at the Sheldonian every year.
So I do find it staggering that the last 6 British Prime Ministers went there. Does that include Liz Truss? Did she go to Oxford?
Yeah, I had to triple check it, but they've all done it.
Oh, right.
Yes, she went to Merton College, Liz Truss.
Now, one of the major benefactors to the university, and arguably someone who contributed wealth which enabled some of these great democratic leaders to study, is a highly controversial figure, I think it's fair to say. In 1870, Cecil Rhodes landed in southern Africa and subsequently became founder of the De Beers diamond monopoly, accruing enormous wealth and power. Tell us a bit more about what Cecil Rhodes did and in southern Africa.
Cecil Rhodes, he was an incredibly ambitious man, the sort of man who could thrive under the British Empire. And the region's imperial dominions and country of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, were named after him. He wasn't born into much. He was merely the 5th son of a vicar, but he became a millionaire by the age of 20, speculating for diamonds in South Africa.
Well, he's done very well if he's managed to get a large country named after him. How did this come about?
Well, fundamentally, he kind of led and paid for an army to annex the region of Rhodesia. This all comes back to Rhodes' psyche in many ways, I think. He wasn't just ambitious, but very idealistic. Rhodes had dreams of one global nation under Britain, and at one point he wrote a will leaving all of his wealth to the creation of a world government under British rules and ideals to be achieved by exporting Britons to all parts of the world.
Wow, that's quite something. And what then is his connection with Oxford?
Well, Rhodes studied at Oxford. He was rejected from University College. He was accepted by Oriel. He finally got his degree at the age of 28. He'd been leading this kind of dual life of academic pursuit among the British elite and, I suppose you'd say, hard-working colonial industry. He lived in 18 and 116 High Street and 6 King Edward Street, and the latter having a large picture and plaque of him on the wall. And despite his wealth, you can see today this wasn't lavish accommodation. And Rhodes ended up leaving most of his money on his death to the university to fund the Rhodes Scholarship, of which Bill Clinton is probably the most famous recipient.
Now, I said he was controversial because I remember roughly 10 years ago, 2015, maybe 2016, a lot of protest in Oxford around Mr. Rhodes. Why was this?
Well, to put it simply, Rhodes was, beyond any dispute, a colonialist and a racist. These ambitions that we mentioned for global government, they were founded really on racial ideals of Britons dominating and colonizing the world. He had really an evolutionary view of race that put his own kind at the top. If I can quote for him, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Now, these were perhaps not entirely uncommon views back then, and it can be very hubristic, of course, to apply your own modern sensibilities to the past. But really, I think you'd have to say few people have ever put their racist feelings to as much practical and, you'd have to say, damaging application as Rhodes. He was a man of immense political influence as well as wealth, and he spoke publicly against voting rights for native South Africans. He described them as barbarians against whom colonizers should adopt a system of despotism. Rhodes may have done good things for Oxford, but it was with African wealth and derived from African labour. Though contrastingly, or you might say hypocritically, it was a condition of the Rhodes Scholarship that it would be open to all regardless of race or religion.
Wow, that just seems a bit discordant with his behaviour and views in Africa. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And what I should have said in the question, of course, was that the unrest in Oxford 10 years ago was around the statue, the small statue on Oriel College, which protesters wanted removed. And I think the college didn't remove it. Is that still the outcome?
I think it's been contextualised. I think that's what they've done.
So the college didn't remove it, but it's been contextualised. So I think that means a plaque explaining. I mean, it's hard to understand this kind of thing, Daniel. But do you think he genuinely thought he was doing the right thing? That's not an odd question.
He may well have done. He may well have been driven by a genuine, if twisted, vision of a better world. But as Jeremy Paxman pointed out when he was writing about Rhodes in one of his books, it does seem that Rhodes' idea of doing good for the world coincided really all too conveniently with his own self-interest.
Right, I want to talk about doing good now. Let's talk about something about doing good. Although even this organisation, I think, is controversial in some circles, which is always possible, right? But doing good, Oxfam. Oxfam was founded in the middle of Oxford. Tell us about that.
Yes, Oxfam was originally the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief and was established in 1942 in St Mary the Virgin's Church in Oxford. Now, its first aims were to prevent famine in parts of Europe under Nazi occupation, especially Greece and the Netherlands, which suffered really horrifically from food shortages under German rule. But it then expanded its work across the world after the war. A remnant today that you can see, the very first permanent Oxfam shop opened in 1948 in Oxford, and it's still there. You can go in it today at 17 Broad Street.
Good. not far from the martyrs.
Yeah.
Okay, and another another noble thing to come out of, well, noble person perhaps, if you're a fan of the welfare state, William Beveridge, uh,
Yes.
studying. Was he studying? No, he was working at Oxford University.
Yes, we should say what this is. And the establishment of the modern welfare state in Britain, which was set up by the Labour government after the Second World War, was really an incomparably radical social change in Britain. And the main basis for this was a landmark report written by William Beveridge in 1942 called Social Insurance and Allied Services, which is better known as the Beveridge Report. Now, Beveridge's connection with Oxford is that he was working at Oxford University as a Master of University College during the Second World War when he produced this report, which was, as we said, a landmark document in the expansion of the welfare state. It became a huge seller and the basis for welfare expansion, including the current system of national insurance and state benefits, plus the creation of the National Health Service after the war.
Yeah. So we've seen an extraordinary sweep of political, religious influence spanning centuries in this city. It's quite extraordinary. So I think that's quite a comprehensive round of politics for Ye Olde Guide. We'll talk a bit about war now, and we'll start off with some of the battles that have been seen in Oxford. Now, my understanding is Oxford was at the boundary of some of the ancient kingdoms of England, and with the Thames running through the centre, found itself at a strategic location.
Yes.
So can you say a bit more about this and the influence that had on it in terms of conflict and battles in and around the city?
Yes, I suppose the main thing to say in that respect is that Anglo-Saxon Oxford sat on the border between Saxon Wessex and the Viking Danelaw, the area controlled by the Vikings. So there were many instances of conflict. The Danes burned Oxford in 979. Probably the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002 is the most infamous. This was a mass slaughter of Danes across Saxon England, ordered by King Ethelred the Unready in response to constant attacks on his kingdom by the Vikings. Now, some historians, in fact, many historians, question just how severe and widespread this was. It's been suggested it could have been exaggerated, that only soldiers from the invading army were attacked. But Oxford, being this kind of borderlands town, was one of the most notable places where it definitely happened. It was described in a royal charter in 1004 from Ethelred, and a mass grave of 37 young Viking men who all suffered violent deaths was found near St. John's College in 2008. The remains were dated to around this time, so really almost certainly from the St. Brice's Day massacre. There's no comparable event around that time which could realistically have caused this. But the massacre didn't have the effect of ending conflict with the Danes, who later burned Oxford down in 1009 and then also caused more damage in 1013.
Wow, it's amazing they still find these mass graves that are just so significant. And, going forward into the Middle Ages, now Oxford has got a certain amount of fortification, and it was a site of several sieges, battles, and incidents going forward.
Yes, we'll talk about the famous Siege of Oxford. We're coming back to our old friend, the Anarchy, the civil war between the nephew and the daughter of Henry I, Stephen and Matilda, for the English throne. We go into more background on this in our Lincoln episode, but an important event in the Anarchy happened in Oxford in 1142, this Siege of Oxford. The events here are that Matilda was besieged in Oxford Castle by King Stephen's forces. She managed to escape very dramatically. There's a proper cinematic Hollywood moment here. In the snow, dressed in white, she left for a postern door, which is a minor door away from the main entrance, past the guards. She walked 8 miles to Abingdon, no Google Maps back then, and fled back to her power base in the west to keep the war going.
Wow.
I'll also talk about the St. Scholastica's riot in 1355. This is a bit more parochial, but still a locally important event. This was a riot, really generally between townspeople and surrounding gangs against students and scholars, town against gown, having a punch-up. There had been violent disputes and resentment bubbling away for a while, with the growing physical and political dominance of the city by the university, and murders on both sides. But the catalyst for this event was two students complaining about the quality of drink at the Swindlestock Tavern, which has now gone, but a plaque commemorating the event is on the Santander, which sits on the site now. Now, it may sound trivial, but this rioting really escalated. 62 university folk were killed as the rioters broke into their halls, but the resulting backlash was very strong. The rioters were punished severely, Oxford's mayor was deposed and sent to the Tower of London, and every year for the next 500 years, the mayor had to attend a commemoration service for the dead and swear an oath to uphold the privileges of the university as a kind of ritualised humiliation in response to this.
So you could say that they had to pay the price of an argument over wine for 500 years.
Yes. A very strong argument.
Very strong argument. And there was background to it. Right. You said our old friend, the anarchy. It's also our bigger old friend, surely, is the Civil War. Any episode about a town that's basically significant before the Industrial Revolution? We end up talking about the Civil War, I think it's fair to say. But Oxford really was important in the Civil War. Why was it so important?
Yes, this is big. And to be honest, we could have equally talked about this in our politics mini section. Oxford was effectively the royalist headquarters for Charles I during the war, and really a sort of de facto capital and royal court. To give some geographical context on where Oxford stood, there is really a geographical context to this because the country was split. Roughly, you might say London and East Anglia, both wealthy regions, were parliamentarian, while Wales, the southwest and the northwest supported the king. The areas in between, including Oxford, were more contestable. So once again, like in Saxon times, you had Oxford in this kind of borderlands between two contesting regions. In Oxford itself, the citizens tended to favour Parliament, though the university leaned a bit more royalist.
That's fascinating. Oh, there's so much going on here. Town and gown, geography of England. So what did he do there? What was he doing in the city? How did he make use of it?
Well, the king and his family based themselves across the university colleges. You had the king in Christ Church, the Queen in Merton, Prince Rupert in St John's. Charles also, as we mentioned earlier, called parliaments in Oxford during this time. They took place in the Bodleian Library, which was used again later to represent the House of Commons lobby in the 1990s film The Madness of King George, and in other parts of the university. But the royalist presence wasn't entirely good for the city. One eyewitness wrote that the colleges were much out of repair, their treasure and plate was all gone, the halls were very ruinous, there was scarce the face of a university left.
Yeah, and I suppose that's because he's using it as like a base and he needs resources, right?
Yeah, it's really this military takeover of the city. Other parts of the university were used for military purposes, granaries, factories, drill grounds, and storage for weapons. Various buildings were demolished, either to hinder any approach from the enemy or to use the building materials for other military purposes. Fortifications, earthwork, and wood were built around the city. There's a small embankment from these remaining in the Warden's Garden at Wadham College. The king also took a huge amount of money from the city and the university in forced grants and taxes he imposed. With the gold and silver he obtained, he had minted special gold and silver Oxford coins. Now, if you go to the Ashmolean Museum today, there's a coins exhibition there, and you can see some of these on permanent display, these very rare Oxford coins. They're a great thing to see if you go to the Ashmolean.
Yeah, so it's made a huge impression on the city. I suppose then, if it was his stronghold, was it the site of any battles? I suppose there must have been in the end.
It was more political than military, I think you'd say, Oxford's importance during the war, but there was some military action. Parliamentary forces besieged the castle 3 times. The first 2 sieges were very small. The final successful siege in May to June 1646 was one of the last actions of the war. The king had already been captured at that point. The war was effectively over, and the siege was ended by negotiation. And later, of course, James II was in the city, beginning his relationship with Oxford, which ended so badly.
Yeah, of course. So lots of importance in the English Civil War. I'm going to zoom forward to the 20th century, and lots of cities we cover on the podcast have had enormous significance on the First and Second World Wars. But I suppose in the case of Oxford, it's a bit different from other places. There's not so much of a visible or industrial war-based influence, but clearly all of the sort of political figures that you've mentioned earlier, there's some association. But I wanted us to pick out Lawrence of Arabia because his connection with the city is particularly strong, and his influence in the First World War and beyond is so important.
Yes, of course. T.E. Lawrence, known more famously, as you said, as Lawrence of Arabia, even among Oxford graduates, he stands out as an extraordinary man. He's most famous for leading an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, as depicted in his memoirs and one of my favourite films, Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence lived at 2 Polstead Road in Oxford as a child, which did come on the market a few years ago in case you want to have a nose on Rightmove. He won scholarships to the university, showed his explorative side in the city and exploring the sewers there. Now, Lawrence studied history and was sent on an archaeological expedition to Syria, where he learned about the military topography of the region and improved his Arabic. During the First World War, he wasn't allowed a combat role because he was quite short, only 5 feet 5 inches tall. So he was given an office job in Cairo, which is where the film starts, and tells the story of him joining the Arabs, fomenting a revolt against the Ottomans, a story he told later in his own memoirs while working in a research position at Oxford University. He actually lost a very famous story around my way, an early draft of the memoirs of Reading Station, but they eventually became the 7 Pillars of Wisdom and the basis of that great epic film.
Yeah, so he really was. He was educated at school and university in Oxford, so really associated with the city. Is he celebrated there today?
Yeah, well, as well as his house that I mentioned, there are various possessions of Lawrence scattered around the major museums. You've got artefacts he collected in the Ashmolean Museum, the Museum of the History of Science has his camera, and the Bodleian has an early draft of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
Yeah, so has gone on. I suppose you can connect Lawrence of Arabia to lots of things in the history of the Middle East. Now, Oxford, on many cities we visit on the podcast, we talk about the impact of World War II, and I suppose Oxford is exceptional as a city that wasn't impacted so much, at least physically, by World War II, and there's some ideas as to why this is.
Yes, Oxford, you're right, wasn't bombed that much in the Second World War. There is a very interesting theory behind this. Supposedly, I will unfortunately be a boring historian and emphasise the word supposedly, it's because Hitler wanted Oxford for his capital if he had invaded Britain successfully because of its architecture and central location.
Yeah, and do we think that's true?
Well, I should stress, as far as I can tell, this seems to be speculation only. The best source I can find is historians using the standard historians qualifier, it's thought that, or speculation is that. And I can't find any record of primary evidence supporting this. But listeners, if you know better, please do let us know, because I'd love to know if that's true. But I should say it is true that Oxford took refugees in during the Second World War. So clearly there was some expectation that the city would be safe during the conflict.
Yeah. And it's also suggested in places that there was some sort of sense that if Oxford didn't get bombed, other university cities in Germany wouldn't. But like you say, there's no definitive proof. But I suppose the influence of this, and we'll discuss this in our urban layout episode, the consequence of this is that Oxford has a remarkably intact cityscape for a British city. Most cities in the UK have sort of holes in their urban fabric that have been filled by post-war architecture and road layouts, and that's less so in Oxford. It's much more intact. In fact, I'd say it's almost entirely intact. That means it has dreadful traffic congestion, but it does at least mean it has a very sort of walkable and consistent urban fabric, which really sticks out. But it is interesting because Oxford did have industry. The industry is not in the city centre itself. It's sort of just outside in the suburbs, but it has a strong car manufacturing industry, and you know that would have been used to develop armaments during the war. So it would have been a legitimate target in that sense. It could just be good luck that it got through unscathed, but definitely an interesting element of its development and something you can feel in the city today. So that gets us to the middle of the 20th century and the end of our politics and war section, I think. And there was a lot going on there. Daniel, how would you sum up Oxford's political importance?
Well, summing up and scoring, the thing that we've never had a single episode for politics and war for any city before, which shows you just how much there was to talk about. And really, we, in many respects, scratched the surface of particularly the university's influence on the world, its graduates, its world leaders, its important figures in politics, and the armed forces have come from there. The thing for me that really sums up the political importance of Oxford is its parliaments. I know we've seen them come up a few times in the Oldie Guide, as it wasn't, as I said, that uncommon in medieval England for parliaments to meet away from London. But this was much rarer later. I think what distinguishes Oxford's parliaments are not just how many it held, but that they were still being called later, including the last ever parliament outside London, the one that was held for so long during the Civil War. The fact that the city was a de facto capital of Royalist England, the fact that the provisions of Oxford came from an Oxford Parliament really shows you just what an important place it was politically. The influence of the university and its graduates is, of course, really kind of unparalleled in England from a political perspective. A 2002 book noted that 20% of the entries in Who's Who were Oxford graduates. Is there anything in this category that Oxford lacks? Perhaps, if you're nitpicking, a major battle, but its role as the Royalist headquarters and effective capital in the Civil War, the incredible story of Matilda's escape from the siege of Oxford, perhaps a turning point in English royal history, shows just how many major military events happened here. For scoring, I'll admit there's a bit of me tempted to give our first ever 10 out of 10.
Oh, you can give it a 10.
I'm just thinking, what do we need room to escalate? Could anything be higher? I just feel like there's potential for one or two other places to be higher. I'm going to go 9.5.
Brilliant.
It's very, very high.
I'm not surprised. And, this is one of those episodes where I've sort of learned as much. I've learned as much in this episode as I have on any other. And lots of rabbit holes to go down. Like all those topics that you've gone through, you can spend a whole day reading about if you so wish. And I was really struck when I was in Oxford a few weeks ago. I climbed up the Carfax Tower and I looked around, and you see this small city, because it is small, with hills rising up the side. You're in this valley. You're in quite a small space. And I just looked around at all these places beneath me in the city. And I just thought of all these things that had gone on, all these individuals that had crossed paths, maybe not at the same time, but like just so many important conversations, interesting people, influential people being burned to death. So much going on, kings, future prime ministers, such confluence of incredible politics, history of the church, religion, history of monarchy and royalty. So I have to agree, it's got to be a top-notch score. I shall give it a 9.
Excellent. 18.5 out of 20. Is that our highest ever politics and war score? I feel like it has to be.
It must be. Must be.
Can't think of anywhere that would be higher than that. Brilliant start there from Oxford on the scoring.
Well, fantastic. That was absolutely packed and fascinating episode on the politics and war of Oxford. And now the next stage in our tour of Oxford will be covering science and industry. There's definitely lots to say there, and also arts and culture. And then the episode after that will be urban landscape, which will be another bumper episode, because there are just so many buildings and things to see in Oxford that will require a whole episode to cover.
Definitely.
All our episodes can be found at our website, theoldieguide.com. They can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and pretty much anywhere you can think of. Please do leave us a rating or review, and we love comments, questions, feedback. If there's anything we've missed, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. That's all from us for now. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.